At the moment, the measures are for 4 weeks, but as you say, Olivier Véran, the health minister, is saying that the peak in cases will be in 2 weeks, which means the peak in ICU will be 2 weeks later. So yes, at the moment, 4 weeks maybe could be short, but that's what was announced yesterday by President Macron. They really tried to hold off having this third lockdown in January. They gambled, saying that some local restriction could be enough to try to contain this third wave. But yesterday, President Macron talked about an epidemic within the epidemic, talking about the variant effect, making it more difficult to control. So these new restrictions were announced after growing pressure in ICU in certain regions, in particular around the Paris area and the Île-de-France region, where the number in ICU patients is already higher than what you had in the second wave of this epidemic. So yesterday, President Macron addressed the nation and mentioned that more restrictions had to be put in place. Take a listen.
Partout, le virus circule vite, de plus en plus vite.
The virus is accelerating everywhere, and hospitalizations are on the rise. Everyone has to make sure not to lock themselves inside, but to limit as much as they can their contacts, encounters, and moments of proximity with others. This means the 7 p.m. curfew will be maintained nationwide. Remote working, which is no doubt the most efficient measure, will be systemic, and I call on all employees and employers to do it at any time where that's possible.
So basically, to sum up, the restrictions that were already in place in 19 territories where the epidemic was already very strong has been extended to the whole territory, for the whole country, for 4 weeks at the moment. So non-essential shops will close, work from home being a priority, and some mobility data seem to indicate that in France, people have returned to the office more than in the UK and the US. So the government was very insistent on this point that people need to stay and work from home as much as possible. No travel between regions, and also schools, which have been a big point of contention because schools have remained open since September non-stop, and the government was really trying to hold off closing schools again. But yesterday they announced that from next week the schools will be closed for 1 week, so it will be online learning, that they moved this holiday a little bit earlier, the 2-week break for the whole of the country, when normally it's staggered holidays between regions, and then only primary and nurseries will come back, and secondary school will start back only in May. So the president yesterday acknowledged that there have been some mistakes made and that April will be tough. We also talk about the light at the end of the tunnel, of course, talking about vaccination campaign, an acceleration there in the campaign with the over 60s being offered the jab from mid-April, so that's a little bit earlier than the previous calendar had been given. They're bringing on vets and dentists, etc., to be able to put some jabs into people's arms. So they get a big delivery of vaccinations also in the first week of April, a bit of Pfizer stock arriving. So they hope that they can accelerate and have all adults being offered a vaccine before the end of the summer. You also talk about a reopening of the reopening calendar that will be presented soon, with from mid-May potentially some cultural venues and some terraces, so meeting outdoors, to potentially be open. But as you say, 4 weeks will be difficult. Already announced that April will be tough. Of course, there's a question of what this will mean for the French economy. In terms of cost, it will be 11 billion euros per month to having all this closure done, some of the support to the economy that need to be put in place to make up for it. And so at the moment, the French government was stable on a 6% growth of GDP this year. So there's a question of whether they will revise this outlook for the economy. Guys.
Charlotte, I tried to read as much as I can of the continental press, but I'm relying on the English language editions. What are people in France saying about Monsieur Macron? Even the sensible papers here in the United Kingdom are being quite critical of his performance most recently surrounding COVID as well. But what about the sensible news in France? What are they saying?
Well, it's interesting because there's really a question of that gamble in January on not putting restrictions and the lockdown then, whether that was the biggest mistake to end up potentially avoiding this third wave. The argument of the government is that, look, Italy and Germany have put tougher restrictions than us in January, and they're still having this third wave. So actually, we won time. We didn't put people locked indoors for too long because they're really worried about a fatigue and a frustration of the French public opinion to be locked indoors. And the president mentioned this yesterday. So actually, people are a little bit relieved from the restrictions announced yesterday. They are less hard than they thought. Remember, in the previous lockdown, you needed a certificate to go out. Time outdoors was limited. It's not the case this time. So actually, people are surprised that it's not as hard as it could be. But of course, the speed of the vaccination rate will be key. And the next couple of months will really determine how the public opinion goes with this.